Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Madhuvanti Hettiarachi, a consultant physician in internal medicine, teaching hospital Peradeniya. Today, we have joined virtually for another peer learning forum conducted by Sri Lanka College of Internal Medicine with the kind patronage of Gates Pharmaceuticals Company. A team of 4 eminent speakers will give an update on hypertension. Each speaker will talk for 15 minutes on a given topic. And you can direct questions to them if you have any by using the Q&A option and chat option which is there in the screen. As soon as you have the one speaker finishes, you can forward the questions. But we'll take the questions at the end of the talks of 4 speakers. As the time permits, we will allow your questions. So without much ado, let me introduce the first speaker for the day, Dr. Sujanita Watulan. She's the senior lecturer and honorary consultant physician, Department of Medicine, University of Jaffna. She'll be talking to you about BP measurement, a pragmatic approach. Over to you, Dr. Sujanita.
Thank you, Madhuvanti, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon to all of you. So next 15 minutes, I will be talking on blood pressure measurement. It's just to refresh our basics and the advancement in the blood pressure measurement techniques and the monitors. So I should not start my talk without mentioning a legend in the hypertension, who is Dr. Norman Kaplan, who has quoted regarding the blood pressure measurement as this is one of the measurement of blood pressure which is likely the clinical procedure of greatest importance that is performed in the sloppiest manner. So I think we all can understand how we perform the blood pressure measurement in the BC clinic and how many measures we actually follow during and prior to the blood pressure measurement. So to start with, you all know that the blood pressure diagnosis of hypertension should never be made on a single measurement unless there is a significant rise in the blood pressure or there is evidence of hypertension mediated organ damage. Also, we should know that we should try to get an accurate blood pressure measurement and also with multiple blood pressure readings. So before going to the different types of blood pressure measurements, we should have a clear understanding of the blood pressure monitors which are available with us. So we use 2 methods, mainly the auscultatory method and the oscillometric methods. So each have different types of monitors which I will discuss in detail. So if you take the auscultatory methods, we have 3 blood pressure monitors. Those are mercury sphygmomanometer, aneroid monitors, and hybrid monitors. We have all 3 in the clinic setups, but still we commonly use the mercury sphygmomanometers. So as you all know, still we use mercury sphygmomanometers very commonly in the clinic and the ward setup, but its use has been coming down because of the concerns of, regarding the environmental hazards. And also we should keep in our mind that the measurement with the mercury sphygmomanometers have many observer errors. We tend to round off the values almost closer to 0 most of the time, like giving the blood pressure values as 130/80 rather than giving 134/86 or something. So there is always a tendency to round off the terminal digits. And also, we all must have experienced the lack of attention sometimes with the surrounding noises and other works going on. And also, there is a tendency for too rapid cuff deflation and other observer errors in the mercury sphygmomanometers. To take the aneroid monitors, we have few in the clinics where there is no mercury and there is no liquid, and most of these monitors are either desk or wall mounted or a handheld monitor. The major problem regarding this aneroid monitor is the calibration and the validation which needs to be done quite frequently. The hybrid monitors are less commonly used, but they are semi-automated and they have an electronic display with the facility of auscultation. So to move on to the automated oscillometric devices which are being commonly used nowadays, here the oscillations are detected by the sensor and the blood pressure is indirectly calculated. There are different monitors available where some monitors can have a facility of multiple reading with a single activation. So we get an average blood pressure reading. And we should keep in mind that these monitors cannot be used in patients with arrhythmia, especially atrial fibrillation, where we need to go for a direct auscultatory method. So again, the oscillometric devices needs validation and calibration, and they don't have the observed errors, but the mechanical errors can happen because of the vibration and trauma. And it has an added advantage of having the automated memory so that we can go back and see how the blood pressure of these patients, especially in home-based blood pressure monitoring. So these monitors can be used not only in the clinic and the wards, but also it is used in the ambulatory blood pressure monitoring and home blood pressure monitoring. Not to forget about these novel devices which have come across the Western countries, but not yet here. There are wrist devices, finger-worn devices or cuffs, smartphone technology and ultrasonography techniques are available, but we still don't know the accuracy and the validation techniques of these devices. So if we are using these devices in the clinical practice, we need to be very careful. So from the monitors to move on to the clinic blood pressure measurement. As I mentioned earlier, the ideal measures before and during the blood pressure measurement is hardly being followed in the clinics. However, still we use the clinic blood pressure measurement as the key measure in the diagnosis of hypertension. So we should take as much as possible maximum measures to minimize the errors. So you all must have seen these pictures in different guidelines saying what are the steps to be followed prior to the blood pressure measurement as well as during the blood pressure measurement. I will not talk in detail regarding these because it is a different, it will take more time. But remember, there are more patient factors, device factors or the instrument factors and the healthcare professional factors which all will affect the blood pressure reading. So remember, the patient should be properly positioned, properly advised and relaxed for 3 to 5 minutes, and we should proceed with that. And also the cuff size should be appropriate for the patient's size, and we should not talk both the patient and the healthcare professional who is doing the blood pressure measurement not to talk during the procedure. So during the procedure that we all know that we should very carefully listen for the cortical sounds of phase 1 and phase 5 to identify the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure. And as much as possible, we measure the blood pressure in both arms and we take the arm with the highest blood pressure for the subsequent measures. Keep in mind that if there is a significant blood pressure difference in both arms, we should go for further evaluation for inter-arm blood pressure difference. Okay. So once we have taken the blood pressure measurement in one arm, which has the highest value, always make sure you go with the second blood pressure measurement. And if there is a significant difference in between the first and the second, then you need to go for the third blood pressure measurement. And try to take the lowest of the last 2 blood pressure measurement as the clinic blood pressure reading. So these are the measures that we should follow during and prior to the blood pressure measurement. So to move on from the clinic blood pressure measurement to the ambulatory and the home blood pressure monitoring, which are being increasingly used for the diagnosis as well as the treatment decisions of hypertension. You all know it has an added advantage of having larger number of blood pressure readings. So the accuracy is more with the ambulatory blood pressure and the home blood pressure monitoring. It has been found that the blood pressure values are lower than the clinic blood pressure, as well as it is closely linked with the HMOD, that is hypertension mediated organ damage, and the cardiovascular risk. So we use oscillometric upper arm cuff devices for both purposes. So ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, you all know the blood pressure is monitored over 24 hours during the daytime and the nighttime, and readings are taken every 15 to 30 minutes. So for a proper reading for the daytime, nighttime, and an average, we should have at least 20 daytime and 7 nighttime readings. If you're only taking the daytime reading, on more than 14 is enough. At the end, you will have average values for 24 hours, daytime and the nighttime. So this information will be there in a standard ambulatory blood pressure reporting, where we have the average values both for blood pressure and heart rate, and also the comment on the Dipper status, which I will discuss later, blood pressure variability and the pulse pressure. So these will be available in the standard ambulatory blood pressure reporting. This is an example of an ambulatory blood pressure reading from one of our patients, where you could see the normal range, which is shown for the daytime and the nighttime in the dark line, and the blood pressure recordings, both diastolic and the systolic, within that range. In this reading, you can see there is an elevated blood pressure at the initial state, which may indicate there is an element of white coat effect in this patient. As well as you can note the nocturnal dipping in between hours 1 to 5. Okay, so this is one of the typical 24-hour blood pressure reading. And this is what you will get the summary from the computer, as I mentioned earlier, a summary for 24 hours, wake up phase, sleep phase, and a comment on the Dipper status. So I was talking about the dipping. So as you all know, compared to the daytime systolic blood pressure, the nighttime systolic blood pressure is lower. Okay, so that is what we call as a normal dipping, which is around 10 to 15 or 20%. There are some cases where you get a non-dipper state. That means there is no difference between the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure, systolic in the daytime and the nighttime, or else there may be a reverse. The blood pressure, systolic blood pressure is high in the nighttime, which we call as a reverse dipper. So these non-dipper and reverse dippers are important because they have more risk of HMOD as well as the cardiovascular risk. So indications of ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, we all know this is one of the gold standard method to confirm the diagnosis of hypertension, especially in cases where we are having a high normal blood pressure or a grade 1 hypertension. And also is being used in cases of where we suspect white coat hypertension, masked hypertension, nocturnal hypertension, as well as some special instances like resistant hypertension, postural hypotension, drug-induced hypertension. And also it can be used for to see how the antihypertensive medications work and their side effects. So these are the common indications for ABPM. We should know the meaning of these phenotypes, like white coat hypertension we commonly encounter, where the clinic blood pressure is in the hypertensive range but not the out of clinic blood pressure, and also the patients are not on antihypertensive medication. There is a term white coat effect, where it is almost same as white coat hypertension, but these patients are already hypertensive and they are on antihypertensive medication. Masked hypertension is the opposite of the white coat hypertension, where you have a mean clinic blood pressure in the normal range, but the out of clinic blood pressure is in the hypertensive range. And most of these patients we suspect when they present with the hypertensive mediated organ damage. Masked uncontrolled hypertension is the opposite, is the same as masked hypertension, but the patients are already on antihypertensive medication. So these white coat hypertension, masked hypertension, nocturnal hypertension, non-dippers and the reverse dippers, and people who are having morning blood pressure surge, that is early morning the blood pressure rise on awakening, all are associated with high risk of hypertension mediated organ damage as well as the cardiovascular risk. So this is a simple explanation of what I have explained about the clinic and out of clinic hypertension with regard to the white coat hypertension and masked hypertension. So few examples of ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, the readings here, you can see at the end as well as at the initial phase of the blood pressure recordings, the blood pressure is high, which clearly indicates there is a white coat effect. The other important thing is that you cannot see a nocturnal dipping as expected in normal patients in this patient, but all the blood pressure is within the normal range. This is in contrast. You could see there is a blood pressure rise in the night time, where usually we expect a dipping state, but here the blood pressure is on rise. This is another example where the blood pressure is always in the hypertensive range and there is no dipping, and there is a reverse dipping instead. So to move on to the home blood pressure monitoring, this is in contrast to the ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. The patients themselves measure their own blood pressure at their home environment. So typically these patients at least should measure 3 days before the clinic visit, but preferably 6 to 7 consecutive days. So they measure the blood pressure both in the morning and evening, two sessions in each time, and at least 1 to 2 minutes apart after a 5 minutes rest. Usually we discard the first day measurement and then take the average value of the remaining blood pressure readings. So again, we use a validated oscillometric device for the HBPM, and readings can be stored along with the time and date in some monitors. And also it is found similar to ABPM, HBPM also correlates better with the HMOD than the clinic blood pressure. The advantage of the ABPM is it has minimal cost because it's just an oscillometric device you can use. It may enhance the self-care and the compliance and better tolerated by the patients. So these are the indications of HBPM, almost similar to ABPM, but generally this is being used in patients to see the effect of the antihypertensive medication, especially how it works, as well as when they complain hypotensive symptoms at home. So what are the challenges in performing ABPM and HBPM? The main factor is the availability of the facilities. We have very few machines to perform the ABPM, and HBPM patient has to afford to buy an oscillometric device. And also the validation of monitors is very essential, which we may not do with the oscillometric devices. ABPM is sometimes very difficult because it's not much tolerated by patients when it keeps on measuring blood pressure every half an hour in the nights. And HBPM, because as I said, it's done by the patients themselves. Some intelligent patients they may try to modify their own treatment depending on the blood pressure measurement, which may have a unfavorable outcome in the end. And also, if there is no memory facilities, we may have to rely on the individual documentation than the memory function. So to end my presentation, this is what we have talked about: the clinic blood pressure, HBPM and ABPM. These are the cutoff values to define the hypertension based on all three settings. So the clinic blood pressure obviously higher than the other ones. So more than 140/90 we define as hypertension. HBPM is more than 135/85. ABPM we have different three values. 24-hour one is 130/80. Daytime is 135/85 and the nighttime is 120/70. So in conclusion, we all know the accurate clinic blood pressure measurement is vital in the diagnosis of hypertension, and the ambulatory blood pressure monitoring and home blood pressure monitoring are essential not only in the hypertensive diagnosis as well as the management purpose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sujinita, for that informative lecture. Our next speaker for the day is Prof. Nirmala Vijayakon. She's the professor in pharmacology and honorary consultant physician, University of Medical Sciences, University of Sri Jawardhanapura. She'll be talking to you on revisiting treatment of hypertension. Over to you, Prof. Nirmala.
Good afternoon to you all. During the next 15 minutes, I will try to revisit the treatment of hypertension. This lecture is based on recommendations given in two recent guidelines. One is 2020 International Society of Hypertension Guideline. The other one is 2018 European Society of Cardiology and European Society of Hypertension Guideline. First of all, we will look at the treatment thresholds. When should we start drug treatment? Immediate Antihypertensive drug treatment is indicated for two conditions. One is having grade 2 hypertension. When blood pressure is equal to or more than 160/100, that's grade 2 hypertension. The other indication for immediate drug therapy is grade 1 hypertension with hypertension-mediated organ damage or high cardiovascular risk. The conditions denoting high cardiovascular risk include cardiovascular disease, diabetes mellitus, chronic kidney disease, and high estimated cardiovascular risk. What about treatment of those with grade 1 hypertension with low to moderate cardiovascular risk and no hypertension-mediated organ damage? The recommendation is to start antihypertensive drug treatment if blood pressure is not controlled after a period of lifestyle interventions. The period given in both guidelines vary from 3 months to 6 months. There is a new recommendation regarding treatment of high normal blood pressure. Drug treatment may be considered when cardiovascular risk is very high due to established cardiovascular disease, especially coronary artery disease. So this is about treatment thresholds. When we look at the modalities of treatment of hypertension, we all know that there are 3 modalities: lifestyle interventions, pharmacological interventions, and device-based interventions. Device-based interventions are not for clinical practice at the moment. They are at investigational stage. When we are talking about lifestyle interventions, we all are familiar with these favorable lifestyle interventions like stop smoking, regular aerobic exercise, lose weight, salt restriction, healthy diet, a limitation of alcohol consumption, especially avoiding binge drinking, lowering stress, and reducing exposure to air pollution. Lifestyle changes may be sufficient to delay or prevent the need for drug therapy in patients with grade 1 hypertension with no HMOD or high cardiovascular risk. They can also augment the effect of blood pressure lowering drug therapy. Therefore, we should not forget about lifestyle interventions when we start drug treatment. However, they should never delay the initiation of drug therapy in patients with HMOD or those who are at a higher level of cardiovascular risk. Coming to the pharmacological interventions. A stepwise approach is recommended for pharmacological interventions. There are 4 steps described in ISH guideline and 3 steps described in ESC/ESH guideline. I will go into details in a minute. However, it's important to remember this before moving to the next step in this approach. Compliance with the prescribed treatment should be assessed. Sometimes we forget to do this. We keep on increasing the, intensifying the drug therapy. This is a sort of a new recommendation. Combination treatment is recommended for most hypertensive patients as initial therapy. In both guidelines, a lot of prominence is given to combination treatment as the starting treatment for most of the hypertensive patients. Talking about the different drugs, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, and thiazides and thiazide-like diuretics all have demonstrated effective reduction of blood pressure and cardiovascular events in RCTs, and therefore they are indicated as the basis of antihypertensive treatment. Coming to the stepwise approach to pharmacological interventions, step 1 is dual low-dose combination. This recommendation is from ISH guideline. Low dose is generally half of the maximum therapeutic dose. However, they state that monotherapy to be considered in 3 groups. 1 is low risk grade 1 hypertension. Second is patients aged 8 years or more. Third one is patients with frailty, respective of the age. What are the recommended combinations of antihypertensive drug treatment for this initial stage? ISH guideline recommends ACE inhibitor or ARB with a dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker. That is the only combination recommended in ISH guideline. ESC/ESH guideline recommends ACE inhibitor or ARB with a calcium channel blocker or thiazide or thiazide-like diuretic. So 2 options are available based on ESC/ESH recommendations. So these are for general population. Beta blockers should be considered in the drug regimen in certain groups. These groups include those with heart failure, coronary artery disease, atrial fibrillation, and those who are pregnant or planning to become pregnant. But when we talk about beta blockers in these groups, for heart failure, it's only guideline recommended beta blockers, bisoprolol, metoprolol, and carvedilol. And coming to pregnancy, it's only labetalol. That's the one which is shown to be safe during pregnancy, safe and effective during pregnancy. Then this combination of ACE inhibitor ARB with the thiazide or thiazide-like diuretics is preferred in 3 groups: 4-stroke patients, very elderly, and heart failure. This is based on evidence. And combination of 2 RAS blockers, ACE inhibitor and ARB, is not recommended at all. This is about starting treatment. If hypertension is not yet controlled, we move on to step 2. Step 2 is dual full dose combination. That is the maximum tolerated therapeutic dose. Step 3 is triple combination therapy with ACE inhibitor OARB plus dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker plus thiazide or thiazide-like diuretic. Step 4 is for resistant hypertension. So step 4 consists of triple combination plus low dose spironolactone. The low dose means 12.5 to 50 milligram once daily dose of spironolactone. Alternatives of spironolactone include higher doses of thiazides or thiazide-like diuretics. With hydrochlorothiazide, we can go up to 50 milligrams per day. When eGFR is less than 30, the preferred diuretic is a loop diuretic like furosemide. The other alternative options include amiloride, eplerenone, extended release alpha blockers, and beta blockers. This is taken from the ISH guideline, as I have already described. The 4-step approach is given there. Step 1 is dual low dose combination. Step 2 is dual full dose combination. Step 3 is triple combination. Step 4 is triple combination plus spironolactone. However, when we look at ESC, ESH guideline, there are only 3 steps. The first step is the dual combination. They don't break it down to 2, like low dose dual combination and full dose dual combination. It's just dual combination. So if that is inadequate, we move on to triple combination. And if triple combination is inadequate, we go for triple combination plus spironolactone. So the recommendations in both guidelines are more or less comparable. Some important points related to drug therapy. Treatment should be well tolerated. That's important. Even if we prescribe 2 or 3 drugs, if patient cannot tolerate it, the compliance will be poor. Therefore, when choosing a drug, careful attention should be paid to the cautions and contraindications. Using a once daily regimen which provides 24-hour blood pressure control is the ideal. Use of single pill combinations is preferred, even though there is it's a limitation in the government sector. In that case, we can go for free combination of drugs whenever single pill combinations are not available or unaffordable. For treatment to be sustainable, it should be affordable and cost effective. And those with isolated systolic hypertension should receive the same treatment as people with both raised systolic and diastolic blood pressure. In this table, I have summarized the contraindications to different drug classes and some cautions required. For the interest of time, I am not going to go through each one, but we need to keep in mind that before, even though we say ACE inhibitors are first line, before starting ACE inhibitor or ARB, we have to check whether contraindications are there for these conditions. Likewise, we need to apply the same rule for all the drug classes. Coming to the last part of my presentation, blood pressure targets. In all guidelines, in both guidelines, the first objective recommended is to achieve a blood pressure below 140 by 90 in all patients. Then, depending on the age and depending on comorbidity, optimum blood pressure target values are given. So if we concentrate on systolic blood pressure targets, in general, for those who are less than 65, the systolic target is between 120 and 129. And for those who are aged more than 65, the systolic target is between 130 and 139. ICH recommendations are more or less similar. For those with diabetes and coronary artery disease, the same cutoffs applicable to general population is recommended. But when we look at CKD, chronic kidney disease, higher systolic targets are recommended even for those below 65 years. The target is 130 to 139 for those with CKD. When we look at those with previous stroke and heart failure, lower targets are recommended for all age groups. Even for those who are more than 65, if there's previous stroke, the recommended target is 120 to 130. However, the most important point I would like to highlight is that the recommended systolic target should be below 140, but it should not be less than 120. Throughout the studies, it's shown that when systolic blood pressure is below 120, it is associated with adverse outcomes. Looking at the diastolic blood pressure targets, in general, it is below 80. Except in one group, that is those with CKD, the recommended target for diastolic blood pressure is less than 90. For all the others, it's less than 80. And for some disease conditions like diabetes and coronary artery disease, the lower level of the target diastolic blood pressure is also defined, that is 70. So the target is between 70 to 79. The third modality of management of hypertension is device-based interventions. There are three interventions: carotid baroreceptor stimulation, renal denervation, and creation of an arteriovenous fistula. All these are principally targeted at the treatment of resistant hypertension. However, use of device-based therapies is not recommended for the routine treatment of hypertension at the moment. So at the moment, they are recommended in the context of clinical studies and randomized controlled trials until further evidence regarding their safety and efficacy becomes available. I would like to summarize my presentation. Starting drug treatment immediately upon confirmation is recommended for grade 2 hypertension and grade 1 hypertension with high CV risk or hypertension mediated organ damage. A stepwise approach is recommended for drug therapy. Combination treatment is recommended for most hypertensive patients as initial therapy. Preferred initial combination is a RAS blocker and a calcium channel blocker or a thiazide or thiazide-like diuretic. Beta blockers should be included in the drug regimen in those with specific comorbidities. First objective of treatment is to achieve blood pressure below 140/90 in all patients. Optimal blood pressure targets depend on the age and comorbidities. Reducing systolic blood pressure to less than 120 is not recommended. Use of device-based therapies is not recommended for routine treatment of hypertension. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nirmala, for that excellent update on revisiting hypertension. Our next speaker will be Dr. Kumudini Jayasinghe, consultant physician in internal medicine, National Hospital, Kandy. She'll be talking to you on an approach for a patient with very high blood pressure. Over to you, Dr. Kumudini Jayasinghe.
Thank you, Dr. Madhuvanti. My topic is how to approach a patient with very high blood pressure. And we'll start with actually a case scenario. Mr. A, 60 years of age, is hypertensive for the last 2 years and presented with the emergency treatment unit with headache, and the blood pressure was detected as 190/120. Do you admit this patient? How do you decide admission? Or how do you manage this patient? So next 14 minutes, I'm going to answer all these questions. So what do you mean by very high blood pressure? Actually, this term, very high blood pressure, not been discussed in the recent guidelines or even in the literature. Instead, they have used the terms as such: substantially elevated, markedly elevated blood pressure like. So we'll consider for this presentation, blood pressures above 180/110 as the very high blood pressure. So in which situation that you get this kind of patients with very high blood pressure? One thing is a hypertensive emergencies, and the other one is a hypertensive urgencies, or it could be pseudo emergencies as well. So what do you mean by hypertensive emergency? There you get the very high blood pressures, with the acute end organ damage or acute HMOD. Actually, this situation, even without this very high blood pressure, if you get a sudden significant rise from the baseline blood pressure, still you consider it as a hypertensive emergency. Remember it. The other condition is hypertensive urgency, where you get a very high blood pressure, but there is no acute end organ damage. What are these pseudo emergencies? That you get a catecholamine surge in certain situations, the pain, distress, hypoxia, hypoglycemia. Actually, in this situation, you don't need to start antihypertensive, but to control the underlying situation. So which patients actually need admissions? All patients with hypertensive emergencies where there's acute end organ damage need admissions. Some patients, even without acute end organ damage, if their blood pressure is very high, more than 220, 120, they need admission to prevent them getting the acute organ damage. Otherwise, the majority of patients with hypertensive urgencies where there is no acute end organ damage do not need admission. What are the presentations of hypertensive encephalopathy? This encephalopathy is, emergencies. The emergencies actually could affect three main target organs: the brain, heart, or kidneys. The brain, they can present with cerebral hemorrhage or acute ischemic stroke. The heart, it could be acute coronary syndrome, cardiogenic pulmonary edema, or aortic dissection. The kidney, it could be acute kidney injury, pregnancy, severe eclampsia, or preeclampsia. Malignant hypertension, sometimes with severe blood pressure elevation, more than 200 to 120, associated with advanced bilateral retinopathy, grade 4 hypertensive retinopathy, where there you get flame-shaped hemorrhages, cotton wool spots, and the papilledema. Sometimes it is hypertensive encephalopathy, where the patient presents with headache, blurred vision, confusion, seizures, or sometimes with coma. The hypertensive thrombotic microangiopathy, where you get the hemolysis along with thrombocytopenia with a very high blood pressure. That the condition improve when you treat the hypertension. So how do you evaluate these patients for the acute HMOD? We all know how to do this. The history, examination, and the relevant investigations. I'm not going to go into details about this. So, but remember not to miss aortic dissection when the presentation is a chest pain. How do you treat hypertensive emergencies? Anyone with hypertensive emergency need immediate IV antihypertensives. So ideally in the intensive care unit with intra-arterial continuous blood pressure monitoring. But most of the time, we don't have that facility. In that situation, we have to care them at the HTU setting. Most of the hypertensive emergencies, the target blood pressure, the first hour should be systolic blood pressure, 25% of the mean arterial pressure. So how do you calculate mean arterial pressure? It's systolic blood pressure into 2 times the diastolic blood pressure that you divide by 3. So the first hour is like that, 25% of the mean arterial pressure. And the next 2 to 6 hours, aim to get the blood pressure around 160 to 100. So next 24 to 48 hours to try to get the normal therapeutic targets. Remember to exclude the secondary causes when it is indicated. So IV antihypertensives is to prevent them going into the further organ damage. Remember it. In certain situations, we don't treat the same way. One is the acute ischemic stroke. Generally, the elevated blood pressure, we should not be treated unless they have a very high blood pressure, 220, 120. Or if they are having another acute HMOD, like in acute coronary syndrome or aortic dissection, in that situation, you need to control the blood pressure. Or else if they need thrombolytic therapy, in that situation, you reduce the blood pressure to less than 185, 110. Remember still, to reduce the blood pressure in the first hour only by 15% of the mean arterial pressure. Don't reduce it drastically. So what about the acute hemorrhagic stroke? If there's no increase intracranial pressure elevation, that situation, you reduce the blood pressure to less than 160 over the next few hours. If there's an increase in intracranial pressure, or if the blood pressure is more than 120, or if there's a large hemorrhage, that situation, you the modest decrease, reduce the blood pressure less than 180 over the 24 hours. Overall, in the hemorrhagic stroke, keep the blood pressure between 130 to 180. So what about the other categories? Like in aortic dissection, the immediate reduced heart rate to less than 60 and the systolic blood pressure between 100 to 120. So use both the combination of beta blocker, the labetalol and nitroprusside. Do not initially you have to beta blockade, then start the vasodilator. If you start the vasodilator first, this dissection will worsen. Remember it. Beta blockade first, then the vasodilator next. Acute coronary syndrome. The reduced blood pressure to the systolic blood pressure less than 40. The IV beta blocker or IV GTN will be useful. Acute pulmonary edema, again the target is less than 140. IV GTN with IV furosemide infusion will help. This intravenous antihypertensive, actually there are many, but the available ones for us are the sodium nitroprusside, nitroglycerin, labetalol, the hydralazine, or sometimes esmolol as well. So nitroprusside, you can see any of these things you can up titrate gradually. The onset is very quick and the duration again short lasting. So remember that with sodium nitroprusside, there are some cautions that you have to. One thing is that we should not let them put the ultraviolet light. The other thing is that with prolonged use, they can get thiocyanate poisoning. And also tachyphylaxis is again possible after 48 hours. So ideally, if you want to give sodium nitroprusside, they need a kind of a monitoring. So need to send them to the ICU ideally. The nitroglycerin, the problem again, the tachyphylaxis after 48 hours. The labetalol, the bradycardia is a problem. Sometimes we can't use when they are already on a beta blocker, if there are conditions like heart failure, or if they are having already bradycardia. So there are some other conditions that you see elevated blood pressure in the hospital setting, like in immediately following major surgery or immediate preceding any emergency surgical procedures, malignant hyperthermia, neuroleptic malignant syndrome or serotonin syndrome, delirium, alcohol withdrawal. There are many others as well. So remember to treat the underlying cause. So now we'll move on to the hypertensive urgencies management. So there is no acute end organ damage. In that situation, you can treat them as outpatients. The first 24 hours that you reduce the systolic blood pressure, mean arterial pressure is a 25% reduction. Subsequent reduction you can do over many days. Remember, if you are sending them home, to review them early, 24 to 48 hours time. Identify the underlying etiology for this high blood pressure as well. You can use their usual oral medications. If they are already on antihypertensive, you can maximize, or you can add another antihypertensive to go for the target blood pressures. This thing you have to important to remember, do not use intravenous antihypertensives or sublingual nifedipine in urgencies, because you have to avoid sudden drop of blood pressure that will lead to the organ ischemia. Remember it. So if there's a blood pressure is remaining high, you have to consider the other causes like non-adherence, the non-compliance of the patient is still the commonest. Anxiety, depression, poor sleep, chronic pain, headache, smoking, the other causes. Think about these things at the clinic settings. Is it due to poor blood pressure technique? Is it due to white coat hypertension? Or is it due to drugs and substances induced? Is the patient on an NSAID or contraceptive pills or other things, sometimes the cocaine, amphetamine? Think about these things. Is the patient volumolar? Ask about the salt intake. The presence of CKD, the volume overload is important, and blood pressure will go up. Think about the secondary causes then. Common causes are the first, investigate rationally for the obstructive sleep apnea, chronic kidney disease, and primary hypertension are the common ones. To summarize, the blood pressure, very high blood pressures, or if there's a significant rise from baseline, if they're having the acute end organ damage, the hypertensive emergency that you have to treat, the ICU or HDU with the intravenous antihypertensive. Acute stroke, aortic dissection, acute coronary syndrome, acute heart failure, you get different blood pressure targets. Whereas other situations in the first hour, we know the 25% of the mean arterial blood pressure. The next 2 to 6 hours, 106 to 100. The following 24 to 40 hours go for the target blood pressures. Hypertensive urgency, where there is no acute organ damage, you can treat them as outpatients with oral medications, but look for the etiology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumudini Jayasinghe, for that excellent lecture. I would like to remind you that you can ask questions on chat session as well as question and answers using the question and answer option. If there are any questions, please forward it to the panelist. So at the end of the lecture, we'll discuss those. The final lecture for today will be done by Dr. Indika Boteju, consultant physician in internal medicine, Castle Street Hospital, Colombo. He will be talking to you on pearls of hypertension in pregnancy. Over to you, Indika.
Hypertension in pregnancy is a unique and interesting field in hypertensive medicine, maternal medicine in our country, and it can lead to poor fetal and maternal outcome if managed inappropriately. Maternal mortality rate in 2018 of Sri Lanka was 32 per 100,000 live births, and it was the lowest number next to Thailand in Southeast Asian region in 2015, according to WHO statistics. Hypertension in pregnancy is the leading cause of direct maternal deaths. However, and prevalence of hypertensive diseases in pregnancy is common, varying from 10 to 20% worldwide. And hypertensive disease in pregnancy are classified according to its onset of time of onset and the progression and the related complications in pregnancy. So we have chronic hypertension or the pre-existing hypertension, and we have gestational hypertension, which is commonly called as pregnancy-induced hypertension or the PIH, and the transient gestational hypertension, and preeclampsia, which is the more severe form of hypertension in pregnancy, and eclampsia, which is the seizures occurring due to preeclampsia. And there can be preeclampsia on top of patients having chronic hypertension in pregnancy. So at the outset, I would like to emphasize that gestational hypertension and transient gestational hypertension, both of those conditions will not have proteinuria, so there will be mild rise of high blood pressure, mild hypertension. And in preeclampsia, in an eclampsia, there can be proteinuria. And in preeclampsia, in its milder form, there can be only hypertension and proteinuria. But on the other end, there can be multi-organ dysfunction of the mother, and including fetal defects, including IUDs and fetal growth restriction. And preeclampsia can be superimposed on chronic hypertension as well, as I said. And apart from chronic hypertension, all the other hypertensive related disorders start before 20 weeks of pregnancy. But chronic hypertension is the one which starts before pregnancy or continues more than 52 weeks, 6 weeks after delivery. So in this illustration, you could appreciate that preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, and transient gestational hypertension starts after 20 weeks of gestation. And they are without progressing to after the delivery more than 6 weeks. But in chronic hypertension, you could see that the hypertension could start before pregnancy or before 20 weeks of pregnancy, or if it starts during pregnancy, it will continue more than 6 weeks postpartum. Chronic hypertension commonly involves primary and secondary hypertension, both conditions, and but it is commonly due to primary hypertension, but need to exclude secondary hypertension as well, because these patients are young patients and in the younger age, so there can be underlying reason, underlying cause for the hypertension. So be mindful to go and find out any cause for secondary hypertension. And we have to assess for white coat hypertension. If the patient says that the patient's blood pressure was normal at home or somewhere else, and it was risen only at the clinic, then we have to be mindful about whether this is white coat hypertension or not. In that case, ambulatory blood pressure monitoring would be indicated. And mass hypertension, we have to look for if we found that the patient is having hypertensive retinopathy or left ventricular hypertrophy or unexplained kidney disease. And usually chronic hypertension is not directly related to pregnancy, except if there's preeclampsia developed on top of chronic hypertension. And gestational hypertension or the pregnancy-induced hypertension, as I said, onset after 20 weeks of gestation without proteinuria. And there will be no features of preeclampsia, including organ damage of the mother. And the blood pressure usually returns to normal within 6 weeks postpartum. And 25% of these patients can progress to preeclampsia. So screening of these patients and following up of this patient is very important with close monitoring. And there can be associated cardiovascular risk later in their life. So because of that, we have to advise this patient to monitor their non-communicable diseases and assessment of cardiovascular risk later in life. So 20% of patients with transient gestational hypertension can progress into preeclampsia, as well as 20% of transient gestational hypertension can progress to preeclampsia. So even the transient gestational hypertension, by definition, it says is the hypertension only lasting for about few hours per day, and which wanes off without any medication. It is very important to follow this patient because they can progress into even preeclampsia. So preeclampsia, which is the pregnancy-related severe form of hypertension, occurs after 20 weeks of gestation with significant proteinuria. Significant proteinuria indicates more than 1+ urine protein from the dipstick, or more than urine protein creatine ratio more than 30. And there can be dysfunctions of maternal organs, including central nervous system involvement, hepatic dysfunction, renal dysfunction, pulmonary edema, hemolysis, and low platelets, leading to HELLPS syndrome even. And there can be uteroplacental dysfunctions, including abnormal umbilical Doppler waveform patterns, and there can be neonatal or stillbirths or IUDs, or there can be fetal growth restrictions. And preeclampsia, the worst thing is it can lead to eclampsia, which is new onset seizures or unexplained coma. And development of preeclampsia has seen on 25% of mothers having chronic hypertension as well. So we have to be mindful if the blood pressure control is going out of a patient having chronic hypertension, then we have to suspect whether the patient is developing preeclampsia on top of chronic hypertension. So at the pre-conception care, where the mother is still, woman is not still pregnant, but she has come for assessment. Maybe a patient with chronic hypertension in their reproductive age coming for assessment. So we have to review all the medications where she is on, and we have to stop all teratogenic medication, which includes angiotensin receptor blockers, AC inhibitors, beta blockers, thiazolide diuretics, spironolactone, and statins. And we have to replace those medications with appropriate medication which can be used during pregnancy. And if we can't stop those medications, then we have to consider giving contraception to her rather than getting her pregnant while on those drugs. And if we have to assess the medical conditions, if the patient can be continue, or whether the patient can have a pregnancy with her medical conditions, we have to assess. And if it's not suitable for pregnancy, then we have to advise for contraception. And it is very important to screen for secondary hypertension, white coat hypertension, and mass hypertension, as indicated earlier also. And we have to look for any target organ damage, and we have to arrange appropriate referrals, like in CKD, if the patient is having high creatinine levels, in liver failure or chronic liver disease, then we have to assess these patients before we allow them to get pregnant. Then we have to initiate non-pharmacological and pharmacological management for the hypertension if found to have hypertension. Usually our target is more than 140/90, either the systolic or diastolic. And ONG referral is indicated if the patient is found to be subfertile, even though the patient is suitable for a pregnancy medically. So the antenatal care, that is after becoming pregnant, should continue on non-pharmacological and pharmacological management. And the blood pressure and the urine proteins at each clinic visit has to be monitored. And so we have to identify the risk factors for preeclampsia and look for the emergence of preeclampsia at each and every clinic visit. And there are major risk factors and minor risk factors for preeclampsia, which could predict preeclampsia on these patients to some extent. So the major risk factors include chronic hypertension, renal disease, type 1 or type 2 diabetes, XLE or antiphospholipid syndrome, past history of preeclampsia or assisted reproductive therapy. And the moderate risk factors includes family history of preeclampsia, age more than 40, pregnancy interval more than 10 years, first pregnancy, multiple pregnancy, and if the BMI is more than 30. So if the patient is having more than one major risk factor or more than 2 moderate risk factors, then aspirin 75 to 150 milligram from 12 weeks of period of gestation is indicated. This is from several trials as well as aspirin trial conducted recently. And we can start oral calcium supplements 1 gram per day, which is also supported by several studies and recently published calcium and pregnancy trial. And antihypertensives, we have to start if the blood pressure is more than 140/90, either systolic or diastolic. And we have to be mindful that our target should be less than 135/85 in pregnancy, and the lower limit should not go below 110/70. The patient is on antihypertensive therapy and having low blood pressure than 110/70, then the fetal blood flow may affected. So we have to be careful that we should not reach to that level also. Then oral medication, we have labetalol, oral labetalol as the first line. But we know that in some hospitals we don't have labetalol. Then you can use nifedipine or methyl-dopa as the second line. And third line, we can use hydralazine or prazosin. And we can use these drugs in combination for patient with hypertension in pregnancy. So the labetalol, if you take, it is a beta blocker with mild alpha vasodilator effect, and it is contraindicated in asthma and chronic airway disease. And bradycardia would be a significant side effect for some patients. And nifedipine is contraindicated in aortic stenosis, and there can be severe headache in first 24 hours. Methyl-dopa, it is contraindicated in depression, but it has a slow onset of action of 24 hours. So it should not be used, for very high blood pressure, like more than 160/110. And hydralazine, it is contraindicated in SLE. There can be flushing and lupus-like syndrome when we use it. So when other oral drugs are indicated, actually, if the blood pressure is more than 160/110 and less than 179/110, without features of preeclampsia, that is preeclamptic toxemia, where there is no any other organ damage within the mother, then we can try oral labetalol or nifedipine. If the patient is having any contraindication for labetalol, we can use nifedipine. If there are no contraindication, then you can give oral labetalol dose of 200 milligrams, that dose. And after about 30 minutes, you can recheck the blood pressure. And if it is still high, more than 150/95, not responded, then you can repeat another dose of oral labetalol. So after 2 doses, that is after 1 hour, still the blood pressure is more than 150/95, then you have to consider IV medication, which we will discuss later. And if nifedipine is given, still again you can give 2 doses within 1 hour apart. And if the blood pressure is still more than 150/95, we have to go for IV medication. Then the preeclampsia with severe features, which is previously called severe preeclampsia, impending eclampsia, or preeclamptic toxemia. Now, if patients are having this condition, that's the first end of the preeclampsia, which is a medical emergency. So we have to seek and look for the end organ involvement of the mother by investigations as well as clinically. And immediate steps should be taken to control the blood pressure. So there can be clinical evidence of neurological involvement like headache, blindness, and blurring of vision, hyperreflexia, and clonus, even paralysis. And hepatic-wise, there can be nausea, vomiting, and then elevated liver enzymes like AST more than 2 times upper limit. Or there can be renal involvement with reduced urine output or rise of serum creatinine from the baseline of the value of in the mother in the first trimester. So the creatinine may not be gone up, but maybe double the value from the first trimester value. And there can be progressive or sudden onset shortness of breath, or there can be hemolysis or low platelet count due to DIC or MAHA. And then the immediately we have to consider about taking the fetus out. But still, you have to stabilize the patient and then decide on C-section or any other delivery method. So intravenous antihypertensive therapy, we have to consider if the blood pressure is more than 160/110 in the presence of preeclampsia. So if patient is not having features of preeclampsia, then we can actually wait and start on oral drugs as we discussed earlier. But if the patient is having blood pressure more than 160/110 with features of preeclampsia, or else if the blood pressure is more than 180/110, then you have to start IV medication. In minority of patients, hypertension may be absent, but they will only have multi-organ dysfunction. So we have to be careful. And rarely, this onset can be in the postpartum period up to 6 weeks. So the patient with high risk for eclampsia can progress to have delivery. And after delivery, their blood pressure also may be normalized, but still there's a chance of getting eclampsia. Especially the risk is there within the first week of postpartum. So what are the IV drug treatment? As we discussed earlier, if the blood pressure is more than 180/110, irrespective of the presence of preeclampsia or any organ dysfunction, we have to start IV therapy to normalize the blood pressure. If the blood pressure is 160/110 with severe features of preeclampsia, then we have to start IV medication. If the blood pressure is more than 160/110 without severe features of eclampsia, we can still try oral medication and treat the patient. And if the blood pressure is more than 140/90 with eclampsia, always IV medication is indicated. So what are the drugs available for IV medication? We have labetalol, hydralazine, DTN, and nitroprusside, but nitroprusside is not preferred because of fetal cyanide poisoning. And GTN is used only when pulmonary edema is a problem, which we can start with 5 micrograms per minute, which we can go up to 100 micrograms per minute. And labetalol, if it is not contraindicated, then we can start 20 to 50 milligram bolus over 20 minutes, and we can repeat it every 10 minutes up to a maximum of 200 milligrams. So once blood pressure is under control, you can start a maintenance infusion. 20 milligram per hour, we can go up to 160 milligram by doubling the dose every 30 minutes. And if you start hydralazine, 5 to 10 milligrams bolus can be given, can repeat after about 10 minutes to a maximum dose of 20 milligrams. So in this illustration, you can see that if the blood pressure is more than 160/110, with preeclampsia, or if the blood pressure is more than 180, 110 without or with or without preeclampsia, we can start either labetalol or hydrolysine. If labetalol is not contraindicated, you can start the medication and go up to 200 milligram and see whether the blood pressure is controlled up to less than 150 by 95. But if it is not controlled, then either you can go for IV infusion and see whether it is controlling. Once it is controlled, less than 150/95, you can convert into oral medication. If labetalol is contraindicated, then we can start IV hydrolysine, and blood pressure is less than 150/95. You can continue with the maintenance dose, and once the blood pressure is maintains around 150/95, you can control and convert to oral medication. So use of magnesium sulfate is indicated in pregnancy with preeclampsia, and it is actually supported by several trials, especially the MACB trial. And it is indicated for prevention of seizures as well as in severe preeclampsia and to treat eclampsia. And there's no role in reducing the blood pressure. This is the very important thing. So after starting magnesium sulfate, we don't think that the blood pressure would come down. But as a side effects, there can be hypotension, but that is in some patients only. And diazepam, phenytoin, and other anticonvulsants are contraindicated in eclampsia. So the loading dose of IV magnesium is IV magnesium sulfate 4 gram or 5 to 15 minutes. Then you can use the infusion followed by the loading dose 1 gram per hour, maintained for 24 hours. And we have to continue the infusion for 24 hours from the time of last eclamptic fit or after delivery for 24 hours. However, be mindful about the magnesium toxicity. It is very much likely if the patient's urine output is reduced, or else if the blood pressure goes down. And there can be a reduced respiratory rate and reduced reflexes and drowsiness, lethargy, and muscle twist. Then during intrapartum, we have to continue anti-hypertensive drugs, and we have to monitor blood pressure hourly if the patient is having mild hypertension, that is the blood pressure, if the blood pressure is less than 130/85. Then if the patient is having severe hypertension, the blood pressure was more than 160, 110, then we have to monitor the blood pressure quarter hourly, and our blood pressure target is not as previously, it is less than 150/95, because we are not going to cut off reduce the blood pressure drastically just to prevent the fetal circulation. And the mode of delivery has to be decided by the clinical and obstetric indications. And please avoid using NSAIDs for analgesia and ergometrin, because they are contraindicated in this situation. And postnatally, please be mindful that up to 40 to 72 hours, that is usually up to 3 days, there can be physiological drop of blood pressure after the delivery, but still there's a high risk of getting eclampsia if the patient is having high risk for preeclampsia and eclampsia. So in these patients, usually we have seen in the wards, the blood pressure antihypertensives are removed and the observation is not continuing, and the patient is high risk of having eclampsia in this period. So up to 40 to 72 hours, make sure to monitor the blood pressure and manage appropriately if the patient develops severe features of preeclampsia. Methyl dopa should be discontinued immediately after delivery to prevent post-delivery depression. Then other antihypertensives should not be stopped abruptly, and it has to be tailed off gradually. Because of that, usually we arrange clinic follow-up after 1 week, and weekly we see the patients and reduce the antihypertensives which they are on. And it is very important to screen these patients for non-communicable diseases, and cardiovascular disease risk assessment should be done at least annually for these patients, because their cardiovascular disease risk is very much higher compared to a non-pregnant female. An appropriate non-pregnant female who did not have hypertension. An appropriate contraception method should be initiated, and we have to assess this patient for future suitability for pregnancy. If the patient is not suitable for pregnancy, especially with heart disease, liver disease, and renal disease, we have to advise for appropriate contraception. And if the patient was on labetalol, actually labetalol is not contraindicated during breastfeeding, but if we intend to give for a long period, then we can replace labetalol by other beta blockers, including atenolol, metoprolol, carvedilol. And nifedipine is still, again, not contraindicated in breastfeeding, can be continued, but it can be replaced with amlodipine if required. All angiotensin receptor blockers and AC inhibitors are contraindicated during breastfeeding, except enrapil and captopril, because enrapil and captopril has some safety data to use in breastfeeding. And thiazide-like diuretics, spironolactone and statins should be avoided during breastfeeding because it is contraindicated. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Indika, for that excellent talk, pearls on hypertension in pregnancy. Now we have got few questions from the audience. The first question is, I think it should be directed to Prof. Nirmala. ACE inhibitors is better than ARB, their question.
Yeah, it's like this, like there are no head-to-head trials comparing ACE inhibitors with ARBs, but some meta-analyzers have shown that ACE inhibitors improve cardiovascular outcomes and all-cause mortality and everything, but ARBs improve cardiovascular outcomes but no effect on all-cause mortality. So based on that only, this at one point there was a recommendation that ACE inhibitors are preferred to ARBs, and ARBs should be started only if ACE inhibitors are not tolerated. But like the other side is that it's found that when ACE inhibitors are started, the compliance becomes a problem because cough is a common adverse effect. So going for ARBs straight away is like justified. However, these current latest guidelines, they do not differentiate between the two. They recommend both ACE inhibitors or ARB as first-line treatment. I think I answered the question. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next question again is for you. They're asking about the indications for nifedipine, diltiazem, and verapamil. I think because we have not spoken, about
in detail. Yeah, I just mentioned like CCB. It's like this. Like I talked about two guidelines. The latest is ISH, International Society of Hypertension guideline. They specifically say to go for a dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker. That is the nifedipine, amlodipine, they belong to that group. Actually, the first line is not nifedipine even, it's amlodipine, because evidence is mainly there for amlodipine. So the guy, so based on that, the first line is amlodipine, or if amlodipine is not available, we can go for nifedipine SR. But in instances, it at the same time it says in instances where these non-dihydropyridine calcium channel blockers, drugs like amlodipine and nifedipine are not available, it's okay to go for non-dihydropyridine like diltiazem or verapamil. So they are dihydropyridines are preferred over non-dihydropyridines.
Okay, thank you very much. Then the next question I think is directed towards Dr. Kumudini Jayasinghe. A case scenario, they have encountered a patient, a CKD patient with resistant hypertension, and it's very difficult to control the blood pressure even with 4 to 5 antihypertensive medications. So how to approach that patient?
I would suggest still, even if it is CKD, think about the other causes, the common causes like obstructive sleep apnea in these patients. At the same time, as we discussed in the causes like the CKD, patients still could be due to fluid overload. So think about their salt intake, ask about the history and everything. So consider that as well. So you might maximize the diuretic therapy on them. So suppose that their GFR is less than 30, in that situation that you can go for a higher furosemide dose. If not, you can go for the maximus of the thiazide type diuretic. So at the same time, think about the other secondary causes on top of the chronic kidney disease.
If I can add to that, actually, I would like to add to that. First of all, check the compliance. That's if somebody is on 4 or 5 antihypertensives, and especially CKD patients, they must be on maybe 6, 7 other drugs as well. This non-compliance with treatment is very common. Like we recently did a study and found that among those with uncontrolled hypertension, more than 70% were non-compliant to treatment. We keep on prescribing, but they don't take. That's something we need to address.
There's another question. Is there a place for IV GTN boluses for flash pulmonary edema with very high blood pressure?
That, of course, not recommended in the guidelines, but still you can give the GTN actually infusions that you can give. You can give higher doses like for the flash pulmonary edema. The guidelines actually did not say about that.
What's the place for ANI in hypertension management? I think either Prof. Nirmala or Dr. Kumudini can answer that question.
At the moment, it's not indicated for hypertension per se, but if a patient with hypertension has heart failure and qualifies for ARNI based on the ejection fraction, then there is a place. But for hypertension per se, it is not indicated.
And there's another question. Amlodipine is frequently prescribed as a BD dose. Is it a correct practice?
No, that's actually amlodipine is once daily.
Question.
There are other drugs also, even like ARBs, drugs like losartan, they are once daily drugs, but we commonly see sometimes they are being prescribed twice a day.
This is for Dr. Indika. Actually, asking about the rationale of oral calcium supplementation.
Yeah, oral calcium, it is like this. Now, they have found that the preeclampsia rate is higher in patients having low calcium levels in blood. So because of that, the trial, what they have done is given calcium to patients who are having low calcium levels, and then followed up and seeing whether the preeclampsia rate was, high or low with that treatment. So what they have found was for low calcium levels and the low calcium intake mothers who are taking low calcium level amount in their diet, the preeclampsia rate was reduced by giving oral calcium. So actually, the rationale, also the pathophysiology of gestational hypertension and preeclampsia is still not much understood. Some say it's immunological, some say it's related to the genetics, some say it's related to the angiogenesis in the placenta, so forth and so on. And the real reason we don't know, but this is what they have observed, and they have found it is effective to reduce occurrence of preeclampsia among patients with hypertension in pregnancy by giving oral calcium to patients who are having low dietary supplementation and low calcium levels in their blood.
There's another question. What are the best beta blockers for hypertension? Nirmala can answer that question, I think.
Best beta blockers?
Yeah.
There is no like preferred beta blocker for hypertension that we can, but again, if there is coexisting illnesses like heart failure, we have to choose a beta blocker which is appropriate for both conditions, hypertension and heart failure. Otherwise, we can choose any beta blocker.
Yeah, I think we have had a very good session today. I must thank all our panelists, especially Prof. Nirmala, Dr. Kumudini, Dr. Suchinita, and Dr. Indika. In such a short notice, they have prepared very nice presentations and very, very informative as well. And on behalf of Sri Lanka College of Internal Medicine, I would like to thank all of you. And Dr. Saman and Mr. Saman and Mr. Dishan from the GATES team for helping us hosting this webinar. And if it wasn't their help, we won't be able to host the webinar. Thank you very much, Mr. Dishan, Mr. Saman, and the team from GATES Pharmaceuticals also. And thank you very much for all your participation. So until such time we meet in another PLA forum from Sri Lanka College of Internal Medicine. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much.